everyone. Hello, everyone. So today, I think we're going to take a look at a really interesting topic area, looking at just the first 24 hours of an issue that we come across, and how these issues are affecting financial institutions today. So a little bit of background about us. My name is Greg Young. I am the SVP of Commercial Strategy and Delivery internally. So I work very closely across our product and intel and account teams to deliver for our clients. A lot of my background is as a comms and crisis strategist. So it's been the better part of my career helping companies through a variety of different issues or opportunities and crisis moments. And today I'm joined by my colleague, Daniel González. Daniel?
Thanks, Greg. My name is Daniel González. I'm the Senior Solutions Consultant here at Blackbird. I've been here a little over 3 years, and my background is as a intelligence analyst. So that's the team that I come from. Prior to being at Blackbird, I used to be a consultant at the federal government level, working on counter mis and disinformation efforts, focused on the 2020 election, and then transitioned into working on the identification of anti-vaccine mis and disinformation for major public health agencies. They're really familiar with dealing with these types of crises, and quick hits, right? As a narrative explodes, it's really important to get your hands on it, so you're not reactive, but more proactive, right? And I'll show us the tools and the process that Blackbird can enable to make that happen.
Awesome. So let's go ahead and dive in here. So the situation that we're looking here, we're going to look at it through two different lenses. So the first lens is going to be, what does this typically look like? What sort of signals does the market get? As well as then, what is it that Blackbird is really enabling with our tools? And the institution that we're going to look at is the entirely made up fictional Trust Us Financial. So imagine this as a relatively large organization, presence in 72 countries, more than 3,000 branches, 180,000 employees, not small, right? Annual revenue, $91 billion, with services across the board from your typical corporate investment banking, retail banking, all the way down to private client services. So again, Trust Us Financial is not a real entity. It is purely fictional for the case of this scenario, but we're pulling a lot of real world inspired by true stories, you might call it, as we're going throughout. Let's walk through the scenario here. And so I'll talk through this at a high level, and then we'll go through what this looks like sort of hour by hour. And it's all going to start with a fake screenshot being posted to a fringe online forum claiming that internal executives were preparing to freeze withdrawals. The team had been tracking this. It's pretty low level anomaly. There's just a few posts and a handful of mentions. It's largely dismissible. But overnight, as we'll walk through, something is going to shift and it goes viral and things are moving. So you're going to experience the next 24 hours as this story mutates, spreads, and collides with market dynamics and public behavior. So let's start with this. First, low-level mentions are being logged by a traditional social media listening tool. So what we can see are there's a spike of mentions noted in this dashboard. And this is largely being associated with just a handful of phrases referencing, quote unquote, withdrawals being frozen, surfacing across some fairly niche online spaces. What's going on here is we can log the volume, but not necessarily elevate this. There's no other sort of context in here. There's no understanding of the actors. There's no signals about whether or not this is manipulated in any meaningful way. There's no risk score. It's just sort of your run-of-the-mill minor uptick that's just logged next to all other unrelated chatter. So what happens at 3:15 in the afternoon is no one flags it, and it stays completely buried. So here we see the screenshot of this fringe communication channel, and it appears to be an internal Slack message from the bank's leadership team. So just reading, execs are escalating to FDIC, wire transfers frozen, withdrawal halt expected by morning. And this is really the starting point of a narrative attack, right? The content is being engineered for authenticity with correct formatting and in a fairly familiar tone. It's believable, not because it's true, but actually because it's familiar. So the seed has started. And next is when the amplification really begins. So a coordinated group of accounts begin posting nearly identical phrases across public spaces. Things like liquidity alert, move your funds, or I just got this message, transfers are locked, get out. And what's really happening here is the activity appears organic, but it's actually being pushed by accounts that had been dormant for months. They've been sitting there. And the traditional sort of social listening tool isn't really going to detect anything actionable here. It's very volume based. The volume is still low, and we're not getting that detection that this is coordinated across the board. Next, we see the narrative mutation gaining speed. You see influencers beginning to repackage the message here. There's no indication about whether or not this is coordinated. Again, this is just sort of the traditional monitoring, but we see an interesting shift in the messaging. Suddenly it becomes much more emotional. This is no longer just your typical text-based narrative attack. There's visuals that are being added, and there's new versions introducing fabricated details as people start to jump on the train. And really what's happening here is the story is mutating. Again, we have no sense about whether or not any of the people engaging with this are organic or if this is planned or not. But we do know it's being editorialized and stylized to drive fear. And today, frankly, especially with generative AI, it's easier than ever to create this sort of content and push it out very, very rapidly. So in social listening, we're going to start to see the mentions rising, but there's not really any way to assess that coordination or trajectory. And so here's where at 1:07 a.m., assuming that we have someone looking at this, we'll see mentions driving up 300%. Sentiment maybe starts to move negative, and we see keywords like bank run or FDIC or freeze or collapse. So what might happen is we might see an alert get triggered, but again, there's no real context here. It's just raw data, and we don't really know what's being said. We don't know where it started, and frankly, we don't know if it's real. So there's not really a narrative or a timeline here. There's just numbers. So let's fast forward, right? Now humans are starting to get back in the office. We're seeing what's going on. They're going to look across the board here. They're going to see these mentions, but there's not really clarity. And so the memo that comes out of this is one that a lot of us have probably seen. Mentions are up. This looks incorrect. We don't really know what's going on. We don't really know who's behind this. Of course, the analysts and the team that's monitoring it don't know if it's real or not. And so they also have to go through the process of checking internally to say, hey, what's going on? Is this real? Might be a phone call, might be an email, might be a message across Slack saying, hey, is this correct? Did we freeze something? I'm out of the loop, etc. Fast forward a little bit, we're now in hour 11. It's an 8 a.m. meeting, the 8 a.m. meeting we all want to walk into at work in the morning with the CEO, the CISO, legal, PR, and the Intel team meeting up to assess the impact and what is going on. We might get a confirmation like, no, we don't see any breaches. There's no cyber attacks. Hey, we're not, we didn't see any of these messages actually crossing on our Slack channels internally. We've done a bit of the forensics. We don't really know what's going on. We don't know where this is coming from. We don't know why it started. We don't really see much visibility into any fringe channels. We have no proof to link to specific behavior or an actor group. And really what's happening here is everyone is in reaction mode and pressure is building. And we've all been in these moments, or hopefully not all of us have been in these moments, but we've been in these moments before where you feel the pressure and you're just wondering what is going to happen next. So what does happen next? Well, perception turns to behavior. Customers start to look across the board, concerns about the economy, concerns about local banks, concerns about what they're seeing online starts to become reality. Customers are withdrawing cash, speculative messages start flooding inboxes. There's fake internal documents that start circulating around on the web as everyone wants to get in on the action a little bit and understand what's going on. And really what's happening now is the narrative has escaped. It is wild inside of the internet, and it is now influencing real world decisions. And teams are overwhelmed and, frankly, sort of chasing shadows, trying to wrap their head around what's going on, and not necessarily controlling that narrative. We are all at this moment just reacting to the narrative. But it gets worse, right? Next, regulators start to reach out, investors start to reach out. The investor relations team is wondering what's going on, and while comms is preparing statements, no one actually knows what's actually real. So comms is moving as quickly as they possibly can, trying to just settle everyone. This isn't real. This isn't what's going on, while also trying to ensure that it doesn't look like the Streisand effect, like, hey, nothing to see here, there's no problem, because we also know that maybe consumers don't believe that. The challenge here is that the entire institution is reacting without any insight, and there's actually no source of truth at this moment. And everything is really being moved based off of lagging indicators. And so what happens 24 hours later? Well, maybe the stock is down 15%. Withdrawals are up over normal. The organization is again in this sort of reaction mode. And we may know that none of this is true, but we're really in the process of trying to convince the rest of the market out there. There's spoof domains that are out there that are up and live. Some are trying to just steal customer information or pretend to be the bank. There's news outlets now covering it because the bank has made a statement. There's other sources out there. And no matter what, there is a story that is here. So something that was never real to begin with has started to spark real results. So the narrative attack worked, not because it was true, but simply because it was fast, it was coordinated, it was believable, and it was unchecked. And it's because everything was built here in a reactionary mode. The tools that we're using aren't built to understand stories. They're not meant to understand actors or intent. They're not built to understand coordination, manipulation, anomalous activity. And the organization as a whole is built around reaction and monitoring rather than anticipation and resiliency. So next, I'm going to turn it over to Daniel, and let's look at this through a slightly different lens now, one a little bit more geared towards resiliency rather than reaction.
Thank you, Greg. Yeah. So I want to run through the same crisis, but now, right, we're going to pretend that Trust Us Financial has proactively sought out tools to help manage different crises like the one that we just ran through, or even just any risks to the brand or to their operations. So same scenario, but just a slightly different context. In this case, we're going to assume that Trust Us Financial is set up with Blackbird AI, meaning that they have been onboarded and trained to use Blackbird AI's toolkit of a couple different tools and platforms that we've developed over years in this space to proactively monitor brand mentions and key industry topics. And this team has actually been really successful in using Blackbird's tools to monitor mentions of cyber breaches or reputational attacks against the brand in the past. So the team is already primed to find, analyze, and mitigate threats to the institution and to the larger financial services community and industry. I just want to review some of the tools that Trust Us Financial is using to conduct those investigations and analyses. So the first tool, the tool that they check every single morning, is going to be the narrative feed. This is a feed of automated automatically collected narratives about, again, key industry topics, or in this case, mentions of the brand that are prioritized for you based on proprietary Blackbird risk signals. So whereas before on the social listening tool, we're really only alerted when volume spikes, on Blackbird's narrative feed, you're going to be alerted when we see a concentration of bots or anomalous coordination and manipulation, or a concentration of negative sentiment mixed in with toxic language, or even the presence of cohorts, communities of ideologically aligned users, like potentially the Wall Street Bets community, or political groups, activist organizations. We have so many other signals outside of just volume by which we can elevate and surface high priority, high risk narratives. And that's always why the Trust Us Financial team checks in on the narrative feed every single morning just to see what are the new items that might be populated there that they should be addressing first. Then they're also using Constellation. Let's say they did find something of interest on the narrative feed, like a spike in mentions of a potential bank run. Constellation is the tool that they're going to use to really run that investigation to ground. So they're going to be looking at specific actors, right? Where did this conversation start? What networks was it pushed through? Was it a specific cohort or activist organization that we've already been tracking, that we have a model built for? Is there really any other details about the posting language and manipulation that we saw, coordination, that we can extract from this investigation? Constellation is where you're going to get the full comprehensive picture from that 0 hour to the actual crisis moment. And then Compass is going to be literally your compass. It's going to be clarifying the situation for you, right? If you're an analyst that comes online at 7 a.m. and you see that there's a major spike in discussions of a bank run associated with your branch, you're going to want to run an additional open source intelligence investigation on Google, or maybe via a large language model, to see, is this really true, right? You're going to be looking for clarity internally, but also from external sources. And so Compass is going to be the tool that automatically checks the context around this claim. It's going to be looking for authoritative reporting from media outlets, maybe industry blogs, company statements that are associated with the spread of the narrative online. So you get to see what's happening online versus what are those authoritative, reputable sources externally saying as well. So you really have the full picture across these three different tools. So again, we're assuming that we're set up with these three tools. Trust Us Financial has the support of the Blackbird Raven intelligence team as well. So they're primed and ready to go. So we'll just run through the scenario again really quickly, but pretending that we have Blackbird enabled here. So sure, we see that minor spike on the social listening tool. But there was really no context for it, no signals about the communities or activists potentially responsible for it, or any levels of manipulation. So it's essentially dismissed. Then that evening, we start to see that realistic looking screenshot spread around in those posts on fringe platforms. And that's when the amplification starts picking up. We see that movement, which is really common in disinformation operations, of the message or the narrative coming from those fringe platforms to more mainstream platforms, where we really see the amplification ramp up. So overnight, right, we go from this little blip in mentions that we picked up on the social listening tool to that massive spike that Greg walked us through. So by the time that the analysts come online, okay, we have the alerts from the social listening tool, but instead of just trying to look at individual posts on a social listening tool, we're going to go directly to our narrative feed, right? We are already a Blackbird customer. So the first thing that populates on our narrative feed is this narrative, right? Trust Us Financial experienced a breach, triggering a freeze on withdrawals and transfers. So already I know the content and the context, right? What is being shared on social media? I can also see where it's being shared. I see that there's fringe platforms involved in this. I see that there is similar phrasing crossing into mainstream public channels, and cohorts starting to pick up the narrative and spread it to their own audiences, expanding the reach of the narrative. And we also see some domains that have been previously linked with malicious campaigns that are associated with the narrative. All of that is served for me on the narrative feed. So just to show you what that looks like, here's the actual screenshot of the Blackbird narrative feed. We have our narrative title at the top. This is what I would be seeing at 7 a.m. right when I log on. I get my narrative title. It's going to tell me this is a high priority item that immediately requires my attention. We can see all of those signals that I mentioned before. We see a concentration of bot-like activity that's flagging as high risk. We also see a level of anomalous or manipulation activity, high levels of toxicity and negative sentiment. We see the scale of the narrative, how large it is, right? How many authors are participating in it, the platforms on which it's been shared, as well as an idea of the cohorts, right? Those audiences or communities of users that are ideologically aligned that have engaged with the narrative. So I also know who are the types of users, what are the profiles of these users that are sharing this or engaging with it, right? All of that has been automatically served up for me at 7 a.m. Rather than me having to go and dig to build this report for that 8 a.m. internal meeting, it's already set up for me so that now I can jump into the analysis. It's not so much about identifying this threat. Now it's about really analyzing it and seeing what is the full scope of this narrative attack. So this is another view that we have now in Constellation when I've taken this into my full investigation. So here we can see that activity, right? Whereas on the social listening tool, all we saw was a massive L, right? An L curve was a massive spike. That's because it's aggregated across the social listening or the social media platforms that they are pulling from. But here at Blackbird, we know that not all activity is the same. In this case, what we're seeing is a spike that occurs first on alternative social media or fringe platforms. That is a key indication of what we call narrative seeding, right? When fringe communities, maybe those activist cohorts or threat actors, might be seeding a narrative on a fringe platform among their own community, testing it out before spreading it through chat groups like Telegram channels or Discord channels, and eventually reaching the mainstream media sources that are really responsible for the amplification of the narrative, like Twitter and Reddit. So we see this, minor spike occurring at 3 p.m. On alternative social media, then getting picked up by those chat groups like Telegram channels. A lot of those Telegram channels, for example, in the financial services context, are constantly discussing trades or financial market activity and trying to kind of take their audience to a particular position. In this case, decreasing trust in Trust Us Financial. And then that's when we see the big L curve that we observed in the social listening tool. That's when Twitter forums like Twitter and Reddit start to pick up the message, and that's the kind of full scope of the development of this narrative. But here on Constellation, we really know the full dimensions of this, where it started and then where it ended up. Taking that investigation a little further, we also notice that in all of these posts, the connective tissue here is this screenshot that keeps circulating around. We found it on those alternative social media and fringe sources, and then we also found it on mainstream platforms like Twitter and Reddit. And so I mentioned what Compass can do in contextualizing content for you. Not only can it check your content against authoritative sources, but we also offer deep fake detection capabilities. So taking a piece of media, like a screenshot here or an image, and running that through our Compass Vision platform. That's what we see here. So all I did was upload this image to our Compass Vision tool, and then I was provided an assessment of whether that image was organic, AI generated, or digitally manipulated. And we also get a confidence score. In this case, we're very confident that this image was digitally manipulated. And generally on deepfake detection tools, that's kind of it. Right? You don't get much more detail than a kind of yes, no, a go, no go. But in this case, we also get an explanation. This is powered by a large language model, providing us an analysis of the image so that you can also share that with your broader team. And in this case, what we found was in the Slack screenshot that was shared, the faces looked a little off. Right? They were really uniform, and our system was able to pick that up. And so it started to raise red flags about not only if the images associated, the screenshots or the profile headshots of the executives associated with that image were potentially digitally manipulated, then that means that the text within that image also is highly likely that was digitally manipulated. So really quickly, again, recapping, within about 30 minutes, we've been alerted of this threat. We know where the threat started, and we also know that the image associated with the threat is digitally manipulated. That's all occurred within 30 minutes. And then within 15 more minutes, what I can do is produce a network visualization. This is a map of all of the accounts across multiple social media platforms that have engaged with this narrative about Trust Us Financial facing a liquidity crisis. So I have a literal map of all of these accounts and also how those accounts are connected to each other. And I also have an engine that powers the evolution of this narrative over time. So I know which are the accounts that started on those fringe platforms on alternative social media, and then what are the connection points that brought this message to mainstream social like Twitter and Reddit. And in this analysis, what we found was that the first accounts that were engaged in this narrative were these small networks of accounts, these little nodes here that all represent different accounts and users sharing this same liquidity crisis narrative attack. And we're flagging them in red because what we've done here is applied one of our risk signals. This is a proprietary Blackbird risk signal, our ability to measure anomalous activity or manipulation and coordination. And you can see all of those accounts on those fringe platforms are being flagged for anomalous activity, meaning that this is literally a coordinated message, a disinformation campaign rolling out before our eyes. And we also see those points of connection. These are the lines that connect them to these bigger accounts, these bigger nodes that are present on platforms with much larger reach and much larger audiences like Twitter and Reddit. So you can see actually the points of connection, right? What were the accounts that introduced this narrative to those broader audiences? And then who are the influencers that picked that up and shared it with their audiences, right? In some cases, a lot of those big influencers, those are represented by these big nodes here, were using just literally copying and pasting the same language. And that's why they're also flagged for anomalous activity. But in other cases, right, some of those influencers or news aggregators, maybe news accounts themselves, were unwittingly, right, sharing this manipulated message to their broader audiences. And that's why they're not flagged for anomalous activity, but organic activity. And that's a perfect example of how a narrative attack can mutate. Something that starts as coordinated and malicious can then be picked up by unwitting audiences. Because again, the narrative was not managed, was not handled, was not flagged, and was not analyzed in a timely manner. So again, within about 45 minutes here, from the time I logged on and checked my narrative feed, I now know where this narrative started, how it developed, where it developed, who were the actors that shared it and started it, and where it ended up, right? I have the full comprehensive picture of the narrative attack within a really short period of time. So what's the result of all of this? Now everyone at that 8 a.m. meeting is fully briefed on the full scope of this narrative attack. We know that it's coordinated. We've traced its speed and its spread. We also know who are the actors that we should be focusing our mitigation efforts on. And we've confirmed that there's no breach, right? This is a manipulated message that's shared by a digitally manipulated screenshot. So now those cross-functional teams, whether it's the cyber team, the communications team, the full executive team, feels a lot more confident with what actions they can take in mitigating this spread. We have a shared threat picture across all the cross-functional teams. So when the market opens, right, the stock dips briefly, but stabilizes following this really early clarification that the unified cross-functional teams have been able to put together. Sure, some withdrawal activity increases, but stays within normal operating thresholds. And the internal teams remain in sync across comms, legal, cyber, and IR, right? So that they have that coordinated message from the Trust Us Financial team that's counteracting, right? The counter narrative against the manipulated message that was identified and analyzed online.
And here's the aha on all of this is yes, this is a fake company that we just walked through, but it's actually all, as I said before, inspired by true events. This is a real scenario. And if you want to read a little bit more about some of these scenarios, first, no, we just can't share all of them and all of the details, but we do have a couple of blogs up on the site if you wanted to look through and just see a little bit more about how this unfolds. So first is the business case, why financial leaders need narrative risk intelligence, and the other one, how a coordinated narrative attack shook U.S. banking trust. But again, there's a lot of additional experience that we've dealt with at Blackbird, helping financial institutions deal with exactly this scenario. Maybe the language is slightly different, or the means by which someone is claiming that there's a liquidity risk changes a little bit, but ultimately it's the same thing. It tends to be in the scenarios that we've worked with, very specific groups trying to undermine trust in a major financial institution, and ultimately exploit institutional biases and processes, and the fact that it takes a lot of time for us to figure out what's actually going on to create a decision disadvantage. And by that, I mean that the outside narrative and markets are moving faster than decisions can actually be made internally because of a lack of common understanding of what's going on. And this isn't unique to the financial space, but I think it's very telling that the World Economic Forum has named misinformation and disinformation as the #1 global risk for a second year in a row. This is on top of extreme weather events and state-based armed conflict and societal polarization and so on and so forth, because this is an exacerbating factor. It just makes all of these things that much worse when, again, the information environment is moving faster than our decision environment. So how can financial companies evolve here? How must they evolve? First and foremost, you cannot plan for what you cannot see. Decision advantage comes from clarity, comes from shared intelligence and understanding across the board, across team members. And frankly, it often comes not from reaction, but from anticipation. As I said, we have a lot of experience looking at different groups that that push these narratives out there. We understand a lot of the playbook that comes from them. And so the first piece of advice I'd give to any company is to understand you're not unique in this situation. There are groups out there that you could be looking at. There are different ways that you could be monitoring online, and you could be building the scenario planning and crisis resiliency inside of your organization. So that way, this is not reaction, it becomes muscle memory. Everyone is aware of what's the role that we all play, who's doing what, and when these come out, everyone's already familiar with that playbook. And this requires an extensive sort of toolkit to understand what's going on. So Daniel talked through the very specific tools that Blackbird offers, but I'll just say a little bit more broadly what's really needed. First, you have to have a tool that can identify the narratives based off of the unique language and networks that they are traveling through. So this can't just be keyword amalgamation. It needs to be sense making. What's going on, and how is that narrative evolving, and how is it different amongst different groups? Second, you need to understand who are the actors that are out there. Who are the influencers, the sources of influence, the individuals, the organizations, the outlets, the domains, et cetera, that are out there? And then what are the tactics and techniques and procedures that they're using to push this playbook out there? We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Next, bot detection. I think that this is very important to identify inorganic activity, but also anomaly detection, because it can be real people, and is often real people, that are pushing these narratives out there in a coordinated manner. Claim contextualization, this is all about, again, speed to decision making. This is why we have Compass Context, the ability to very quickly look through the claims that are out there, understand what's going on, what's real, what's not, without having to go through Google or other search engines for it. And then finally, deepfake detection that is multimodal in nature. So video and imagery across the board. All of these are required to contextualize what is going on. So I'll spend a little bit of time just quickly hitting on what maturity looks like in this space. And so there's really three key phases when we think about maturity with our clients that we guide them on. So it is this exploring phase, a proficient phase, and a leading phase. And so in the exploring phase, really what we see are that organizations are fairly good at using sort of social listening tools and other media monitoring tools, but they're built for marketing, not really built for risk. And so they're trying to sort of retrofit. On the analysis side, it's the types and techniques that the analyst is using and what they're able to see. We see it's relatively low automation of signal detection. It's a lot of human effort, looking across a lot of posts, trying to understand what's going on, trying to prioritize what they should be paying attention to. They tend to be siloed inside of the organization with pretty limited cross-functional engagement. Their job is to alert teams to high risk, but their analysis is usually built off of sort of tabular data and oriented around volume and time series. And frankly, we see exactly what happened in the first half of the scenario. Response is reactive in nature. Second is organizations that are becoming a little bit more proficient. And here we can see organizations focusing a lot on data. They're taking data from a lot of different social media platforms. They may even be using custom scraping or data ingestion opportunities. The analysis, much more effective, identifying high-risk signals and bot-like traffic, anomalous activity. They're tracking narratives across platforms. They're able to quickly identify the sources of influence, relative influence on each other, such as via network analysis. The ability to spot very rapidly sophisticated actors and ultimately informing cross-functional teams and providing much more of that proactive posture against those rising narrative threats. But there is one more level. You would think proficient is leading, but really leading is leading. And this is where organizations, the most sophisticated organizations we work with have a few defining characteristics. First, they're integrating and analyzing custom data sources that are really purpose-built for their uses. Yes, they're able to react quite well and identify those high-risk signals, but this is more about resiliency. They're spotting high-risk activity well in advance to inform those time-sensitive scenarios. They've adopted a more sophisticated approach to understand actors. So using a TTP framework, which I'll walk through briefly in a moment, they can differentiate between sophisticated and unsophisticated actors using that framework. And they're typically integrating at a very deep level, deepfake detection and the ability to detect digitally manipulated imagery and videos. And what that comes to is they have a broad toolkit of remediation strategies. They're developing proactively counter strategies that are aligned with the information operation threat lifecycle, also known as a kill chain, utilizing best practices there. And they're also tracking the effectiveness of their counter narrative strategies. And core to all of this is moving again from this sort of past backward looking feedback reactive orientation towards resiliency, a proactive approach. I'd encourage all of you just go Google around a little bit OODA, the observe, orient, decide, and act framework, and start to think about how to incorporate that into the organization. This is absolutely a critical component for us and requires really a philosophical shift in the approach of the overall organization. So assuming that we're much more in that OODA loop now, the next is to look at what is the stack of technology that you need. So here's where we might look across the board and see we're bringing in public domain data and we're doing this broad data collection. We're doing the signals monitoring across the board, and we're focusing on narratives and actors and networks. Critically then is this component around understanding TTPs. And this is critical to disrupting the execution of an information or narrative attack. So TTPs are tactics, techniques, and procedures. If you've worked in the cyberspace, you may recognize these from the world of cyber, but I'm just going to take you through very high level at the moment what this starts to look like in the information operation environment. So this is a limited view of a broader TTP framework, but essentially what we've done is take all of the different means of how an actor would engage, from starting with targeting and developing their network, all the way down to mobilizing and creating persistence in their narrative, and have mapped out, again, this is a limited view, a lot of the tactics that we have seen. And what's interesting about a TTP framework is not only does it orient the teams towards the types of attacks that are out there, but it also acts very much like a fingerprint. We can, if we detect the same TTPs being used over and over again, we often know that those are coming from the same groups that are out there because they're using the same things in their toolkit, the ones that they understand to move forward. In addition, and we won't get into this now necessarily, but TTPs also help identify some of the means in which you might counter the narratives that are out there. That is for a much deeper conversation and another time. But how did these TTPs help us? One, again, these are a fingerprint, and it allows you to identify these threat actors much more easily. It also allows you to predict the future behavior of these threat actors. Next, it also allows us to understand where in that kill chain, in that threat cycle, the actor is. Again, understanding that they're not going to stop at one phase, they're going to move to the next one, and allows us to anticipate what it is they're going to do next. And finally, identify those points of intervention. What can we do to keep or to prevent this narrative attack from progressing through that kill chain? Often, which, by the way, occurs over a series of weeks or months, not necessarily within the matter of hours that we've seen. Once you're seeing it at that point, you're really in the amplification or persistence phases. And so finally, as we're thinking about how to weather these narrative attacks, just a few key takeaways here. One, you have to recognize that bad actors are constantly expanding their toolkit, but we're also expanding our toolkit on a regular basis to detect and expose coordination between them. I've said this a ton throughout. Companies have to move away from a reactive stance and start to build a proactive one, build that resiliency and organizational muscle memory. No matter how quickly we get, it still comes down to, in the analysis, it really comes down to how quickly an organization can make decisions and move in these moments. And nothing beats having that muscle memory in place. Very critically, we encourage clients all the time, move beyond narrative tracking, start to understand the actors. When you're understanding the actors that are out there, it makes it much easier to monitor and frankly, much easier to anticipate. We would strongly recommend look at counter malign influence programs and best practices. If you're not aware of them, come talk to us. We're happy to talk you through and help educate on what are the best practices that we have seen, but there's a lot out there. And finally, we have to be prepared for this next generation of narrative conflict. I cannot stress this enough, but the rise of generative AI, the ability to stand up very sophisticated networks very quickly and push out information has just dramatically changed the speed in which information operations or narrative attacks occur. And so we all have to be building both the tech stack as well as the capabilities internally, that muscle memory, in order to really deal with this next generation. So if you want to learn a little bit more, please reach out to us. We're happy to chat with you about anything in these scenarios, share our experiences. We'd also recommend if you want to receive a risk assessment for your own organization, we're happy to go out and do that analysis on your behalf to see what are the risks that might be posed towards your organization. And in the meantime, just feel free to send either myself or Daniel an email or book a demo at blackbird.ai/book-a-demo / or just visit us on Blackbird.AI. So appreciate the time, everyone. Hopefully this was helpful for all of you, and we look forward to hearing a bit more.
Thanks, guys.